around Australia and the world, both in person and online, for this public panel on the topic Lenin and the National Question. Co-hosted by Platypus chapters from the Australian National University, the University of Melbourne, the University of Auckland and Sydney. My name is Con and I'll be moderating for this event. This is the first panel held at the first Platypus Oceania conference and hopefully will be the start of many more in the future. Platypus Affiliate Society, established in December 2006 in Chicago, organizes reading groups, public fora, research and journalism focused on the problems and tasks inherited from the old 1930s and 1920s, new 1960s and 1970s, and post-political 1980s and 1990s left, all for the possibility of emancipatory politics today. You can learn more about our activities on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter through @PlatypusMelbourne or by visiting our website www.platypus1917.org. We also have a podcast titled Shit Platypus Says, which can be streamed on SoundCloud, and a monthly international open access publication called the Platypus Review. You'll find free copies available on the table at the site. Platypus Melbourne also runs a reading group where we go through a yearly syllabus from Rousseau to Marx to Lenin to Adorno, trying to understand what Marxism was. The panel topic for today is Lenin and the National Question, and the panelists have been asked to respond to the following prompt. The figure of Lenin has haunted historical discussions surrounding the national question. Lenin saw self-determination as strategic, being prompted by the revolutionary class struggle of the proletariat. Nation self-determination was part of the democratic struggle, and one of the proletariat had responsibility to lead. It has been the absence of this leadership, i.e. the party, that recent generations on the left have appropriated slogan that Lenin would perceive as not proletarian, but democratic. Do these historical positions and discussions matter for the left in the 20th century? And if so, how? What role did the nation play in the bourgeois revolutions, and how did this change with capitalism and imperialism? How does nationalism of the repressed relate to socialism? What obstacles does nationalism pose for the same task? Our format is simple. Each of the four speakers, will have around 12 to 15 minutes for opening remarks, then 5 to 7 minutes each after everyone has spoken to respond and discuss questions related to the other panelists. Then, after a very short break, we'll have an hour or so of audience Q&A. If time permits, we'll also take questions from the online audience. For the Q&A, I hope to all only call on questions. If you an audience have more comments, then I encourage you to work it into a short piece of writing and submit it to the Platypus Review, where transcripts from this event will be published along with selected responses. Our speakers for today are read out in an agreed-upon speaking order. Amal Samaha is a supporter of the international Bolshevik tendency. She has written for publications including 1917, Cosmonaut and the Spin-Off, and recently completed a thesis on historiography of Titiriti Owatangi. She is an Australian-Lebanese trans woman and lives in Wellington, New Zealand. Anthony Furia is a communist youth involved in organising since 13, promoting revolutionary politics and student radicalism, and is a uni Melbourne undergrad. Currently, Anthony serves on the chair of the Central Committee of the Revolutionary Communist Organisation. Arthur Dent is an unreconstructed Marxist, meaning unrepentantly old-fashioned in the Maoist tradition. He was a prominent student activist at Monash University during the Vietnam War years and a former member of the CPA-ML. He founded the Eureka movement in the late 1970s and is today a contributor to C21stleft.com. Isaac is an Iranian Australian Marxist-Leninist and an educator that has been studying Marxist theory for the last 8 years. Having briefly organised as part of the Australian Communist Party, Isaac and a fellow party member left the organisation in 2022 and started the Eureka Collective in July 2022 with the aim of developing new theoretical insights and critiquing the orthodoxy of the Western left. The event will conclude around 12:30, after which we plan to take a short break for lunch before coming back to continue the rest of the day's events, namely a public interview with Vincent Fitzgerald on the Alliance at 11:30 for our penultimate panel, What Was Neoliberalism, at 4 p.m. With that, I hand it over to Amal, who will begin her opening remarks.
Okay. Thank you. So the prompt asks whether Lenin's positions on the national question still matter today, and relatedly, how we should approach present-day nationalism. We'll inevitably end up spending most of the discussion on that, but since I'm speaking first, I wanted to start by trying to establish what Lenin actually thought about nations and how his views evolved during his life. Lenin inherited his position on the national question largely from late 19th century social democracy, especially that of Karl Kautsky and the elder Engels. Earlier, Marx and the younger Engels had a somewhat different view, shaped by two factors: a democratic revolutionary tradition inherited from French communism, most evident in Marx and Engels' early writings on Polish independence, and a colder strategic calculation: what national configurations would most likely foster revolutions in which the working class could play a decisive role. For Marx and Engels, the consolidation of small territories into larger states under more advanced bourgeois tutelage was essential for advancing radical democracy and developing the productive forces. They rejected Bakunin's sentimental advocacy of all nations to self-determination, which they saw as leading to small backward states vulnerable to reactionary empires like Russia. They distinguished between historically progressive movements of the great peoples of Europe, who had both the right and duty to form nation-states, and the varied nationalisms of small peoples, for whom no general approach could apply. Only some, like the Irish, needed independence to reduce antagonisms with the dominant nation's working class in order to better pursue revolutions in both countries. Where did the idea of a general right to self-determination come from then? It emerged alongside changes in the objective situation. By 1870, German unification was complete, and later in life Marx began to anticipate that Russia might turn from a bastion of reaction to a pioneer of social revolution. By the 1880s, Engels noted that after the overthrow of Tsarism, the peoples of Eastern Europe would finally be free to settle among themselves the boundaries of their individual national territories. But it was Kautsky who broke from Marx and Engels' view of Tsarism as uniquely reactionary, instead treating all the multinational empires of Central and Eastern Europe as feudal relics that oppressed other nations. This shift opened Marxism to the idea that self-determination wasn't just a future possibility, but a democratic right to be actively fought for in the present as part of social democracy's minimum program. Lenin had fully adopted this view by the time he began writing regularly on the national question in 1903. His position was so close to Kautsky's that I'll address Kautsky largely through Lenin, who until 1914 mainly criticised him for wavering in his application of his own program. Notably, Lenin's stance on the national question remained remarkably consistent from 1903 onwards, with later developments building on rather than replacing his original framework. Lenin's position was first made extremely clear in an article in Iskra on a manifesto written by the Armenian Social Democrats. I'll read this part out in full because, despite being the first time he elaborated them, it's a very concise summing up of his views. It's not the business of the proletariat to preach federalism and national autonomy. It is not the business of the proletariat to advance such demands, which inevitably amount to the demand for the establishment of an autonomous class state. It is the business of the proletariat to rally the greatest possible masses of workers of each and every nationality more closely, to rally them for struggle in the broadest possible arena for a democratic republic and for socialism. And since the state arena in which we are working today was created and is being maintained and extended by means of a series of outrageous acts of violence, then, to make the struggle against all forms of exploitation and oppression successful, we must not disperse, but unite the forces of the working class, which is the most oppressed and most capable of fighting. The demand for recognition of every nationality's right to self-determination simply implies that we, the party of the proletariat, must always and unconditionally oppose any attempts to influence national self-determination from without, by violence or injustice. While at all times performing this negative duty of ours to fight against and protest against violence, we on our part concern ourselves with the self-determination of the proletariat in each nationality, rather than with self-determination of peoples or nations. Thus, the general, basic and ever-binding program of Russian social democracy must consist only in the demand for equal rights for all citizens, irrespective of sex, language, creed, race, nationality, etc., and for their right to free democratic self-determination. As to support the demand for national autonomy, it is by no means a permanent and binding part of the program of the proletariat. This support may become necessary for it only in isolated and exceptional cases. So here the majority of Lenin's original program is already laid out. In short, Marxists advocate for whatever will lead to the fighting unity of divided working classes. We oppose utterly all state efforts to force national unity or disunity onto the class. If there is a clear evidence of a nation itself wishes it, we support independence in order to continue the business of fighting together with the workers of that nation. We support the equality of those nations that remain within multinational states. We do not advocate for increased separation or measures likely to lead to it, like autonomy, but we accept that these are sometimes necessary. In a follow-up article, Lenin answered a number of questions from critics about this program. Does supporting the right of self-determination mean supporting it being carried out? No, Lenin says. Our unreserved recognition of the struggle for freedom to self-determination does not in any way commit us to supporting every demand for national self-determination. This was a theme he returned to many times. Do Marxists support national bourgeois movements? No, says Lenin. We support their rights, just as we support the rights of Jesuits to agitate, but oppose an alliance of Jesuits and workers. Does support for the right to self-determination contradict the struggle for a united proletariat? Often, says Lenin, and where it does, we support the latter over the former. Does opposing a multinational state mean advocating its destruction by various national movements, what we would today call balkanization? No, says Lenin, it is clearly better if the proletariat of that state fights together, and we only support self-determination if national distrust and conflicts are getting in the way of that fight. In short, the emphasis here is very much on adopting appeals to the right to self-determination to set national movements to one side and get back to the main focus of class struggle. In 1913 to 14, several developments pushed Lenin to revisit the national question. After the failed 1905 revolution, the Tsar leaned heavily on Great Russian chauvinism, with black hundreds attacking minorities who themselves increasingly turned to separatism or cultural autonomy. In Poland, Rosa Luxemburg rejected the right to self-determination, calling Polish independence a petty bourgeois utopia and anticipating that instead Polish workers would join in on the Great Russian Revolution. Lenin responded by restating and deepening his 1903 position, opposing both the autonomists, who reinforced national divisions, and Luxemburg, who denied the possibility that changing conditions could make support for Polish independence both viable and necessary to win workers from nationalism. Lenin's first major additions to this national program came with his break with social democracy over imperialism and the labour aristocracy. In 1916, he argued that his earlier program applied only to multinational, semi-developed states like those in Eastern and Central Europe. In advanced capitalist nations, there was no possibility whatsoever that a national movement could be progressive. Some of our panellists might disagree. And in countries colonised by these states, it was not enough to support the right of self-determination, but in fact Marxists must support a revolutionary war against colonialism, whether or not there is existing support for one. By the time of the Russian Revolution then, Lenin's position on the national question prior to the dictatorship of the proletariat had largely matured. For those of us who argue in Lenin's terms, these three categories outlined in 1916 provide a useful toolbox with which we can orient to and overcome nationalist currents. However, a theoretical framework doesn't help if we lack the basic political appetite to use it to its intended end. We can, for example, misapply Lenin's categories to suggest that everywhere on earth has achieved the stage of such advanced capitalism that no national liberation movement could be historically progressive, and all are equally oppressive, as many left communists do. Conversely, we could project a relationship comparable to direct colonisation onto every nationalist movement, with even the slightest claim to oppression, essentially cherry-picking bits of Lenin to adopt the very tailist and apologist attitude to nationalism he strove to oppose. My own view is that in the century since Lenin's death, we have neither progressed past the stage where national liberation is a relevant concept, nor is national liberation the key force for world revolution Lenin argued it was from 1916 till his death. He wrote at a time when the European world empires of high colonialism were primed for dismemberment by the unprofitability of maintaining such empires through force, by anti-colonial movements, by increasingly independent settler colonial nations, and at the hands of newer forms of imperialism like that of the United States. While a handful of directly colonised nations of the classic type remain, such as Canada or Puerto Rico, those movements for national independence that were going to succeed largely have. And though none achieved liberation from imperialism, the creation of new neo-colonial nation states was enough to provide a release valve for much of the agitational force of demands for self-determination. What remain today are the hard cases, contested territories claimed by two peoples, minorities too small or dispersed for viable independence, or colonies with entrenched settler populations. These dilemmas exist to some degree in most states. Our task isn't to ignore national struggles or to force them into models of classical national liberation. Lenin's original program for multinational states from 1903 until his death remains crucial. Marxists must do whatever it takes to force the trust and unity needed for a multinational class struggle. Whether we support or oppose a demand for self-determination itself depends on subjective desire and objective possibility, but the right to self-determination is non-negotiable. Our goal in adopting this demand isn't to make some new ism as an alternative to nationalism, some national liberationism that exists as a halfway house between nationalism and socialism. Our goal is to break people from nationalism to Marxism. That requires following Lenin not just where he acquiesced to forms of separation between oppressed and oppressor nations, but his overall goal of fostering a fighting unity across all national lines. Thank you.
Cool. Hello, comrades. Let me just, let's see. I'll begin with a brief thank you to all for attending what will undoubtedly be an interesting panel, if nothing else. And my thanks to Comrade Amal for their previous speech. I'll also attempt to expedite the boring part of this process, establishing any definitions and semantic clarification so we can proceed to the meat of the matter, which is those lovely sub-questions that Platypus likes to pose us panelists. In fact, they pose several in every single main question. Platypus, thankfully, and also Amal actually, has already provided, I think, a quite adequate summation of the position of self-determination in communist thought historically and in relation to democratic struggle. It's short, but in the main I agree. Self-determination is strategic, prompted by revolutionary class struggle of the proletariat and part of the democratic struggle that the proletarian class, and thereby the proletarian party, must lead. It and its linguistic siblings, such as national liberation and the oppressed nations, have undergone distortions, abuses, and other sleights of hands by a fragmented communist movement, particularly over the last 40 years. Our job now is a clarification of the role and place of the national question generally, and the communist response to it, in a time where communists seem capable of disagreeing on every matter under and including the sun itself. Do the historical positions and discussions on the national question, in specific instances and theoretically speaking, matter for the 21st century left? They certainly do, but, and this is critical, not in the sense that I believe many communists seem intent to make them. I'm thinking here of the position of some communists on, say, the Syria question, on the countless China questions, on the Cuba question, etc. Many of these are not ones that necessitate the divisions of a 21st century left into endless camps of support and not support, denial, acceptance, agreement, and criticism. The question of theoretical support for certain national liberation struggles or applications of the notion of self-determination in particular instances does not bear any need for strict, disciplined, highly specific theoretical unity as such. Yet, it must be said that in every specific instantiation of grappling with self-determination and the nation-state, there is a kernel of historical, theoretical truth and import. In cases such as Russia-Ukraine or versions of the China question, the national question returns to something more central, more concrete, and in fact at the very heart of Lenin's theorization on the question itself, the question of our nation. That is, the question of unrelenting disloyalty to our nation, to our state, as uncompromising revolutionaries. A coherent, consistent revolutionary strategy demands we identify the enemy first and foremost as the one at home. We wish to bring an end to the bourgeois order, and that begins with the struggle against our bourgeoisie, against the interests of our state and its imperialist alliance. We must strike against the international interests of capital, and thus a capitalist world system, as they manifest and interfold within the interests of our state. Thus, constant opposition to the position of our state in struggles, wars, and geopolitical ruptures writ large is an unremitting necessity for both theoretical internationalism and revolutionary practice. When it comes to national liberation, then, to the right to self-determination in the age of an imperialist world system, we support it in the context of the interests of our own nation-state, and thereby in opposition to an imperialist world system as a whole. Through an orientation to the question of state disloyalism or loyalism, supplemented as it must be by the democratic question, we can interrogate the historical role of the nation, the nationalism of the oppressed, and the obstacles nationalism poses to socialism itself. To begin in reverse order, the problems posed by nationalism qua nationalism to the socialist project are blatantly apparent to anyone who has not willed themselves into total theoretical blindness through obfuscation and ineptitude. Nationalism is incompatible with scientific socialism, which by its nature is internationalist. Why is this opposed to nationalism as such? For a multitude of reasons. The first is the practical question, again, of state loyalism and disloyalism. Nationalism, insofar as it is historically progressive, can only be so to the extent that the nation does not constitute an existing cemented bourgeois state. The moment nationalism assumes a state character, we are confronted with the contradiction between the interests of the class, the international universal working class, and the interests of the nation, the specific stratified Geist that escapes stable definition. Communism demands always the total sacrifice of the latter and the overdetermination of the former. A communist is unrelentingly disloyal to their own bourgeois state precisely because a communist embodies a scientific socialist consciousness, a consciousness of the international class and international class society. The first enemy is always the enemy at home. To adopt nationalism, a loyalty to a nation, a home, above or alongside that of the interests of the class with no nation, necessitates contradiction. One can only be disloyal to their own state if they reject it in its entirety, and thus reject the nation it pretends to or claims to embody. What nation is being held loyal to here? A cultural ethnic unit? What precisely is there to be proud of here beyond a rhetoric of blood and soil? Again, the nature of a socialist consciousness is one that cognizes international class society. The interests of a revolutionary class, a revolutionary subject, are not tied to the interests of a nation. That is not to say that the two may not overlap. The national question here is important precisely because national liberation is a precondition for democratic revolution, itself a force of proletarian power. But there is no nationalism here to national liberation, or there should not be from socialists. We have seen quite clearly where this gets us in Palestine, in Iran, in Lebanon, etc. The national bourgeoisie are incapable of the task set out for them, the task of national democratic revolution. A loyalty to the nation in the form of nationalism strategically aligns communist forces with inept, incapable, backward bourgeois ones because of a shared national identity. Communists must not have their hands tied to the fate of these class forces. This, again, is not to rule out the political instances in which the interests of such forces in national liberation may align, and tactical collaboration may become a tactical necessity. Yet the communist movement, the proletarian movement, must seek hegemony over democratic revolution and constant class independence. It must seek hegemony over the struggle for national liberation precisely because it cannot and should not rely upon the bourgeois state or class forces. What nationalism does, as strategy interpolated by ideology, is to precisely imply what is, in the 21st century more than ever, a suicide pact between bourgeois forces and the communist movement in oppressed nations. Such a response, I think, in some ways provides an answer to the question of the nationalism of the oppressed, but I'll briefly touch on it explicitly here. The nationalism of the oppressed is beneficial insofar as it aligns with the interests of democratic revolution. Yet it is, of course, a double-edged sword, a weapon that cuts its wielder. The more socialists succumb to the rhetoric of the primacy of the nation, of nationalism, the less they can heighten socialist consciousness and the less they possess such consciousness themselves. The minute an oppressed ceases to be oppressed writ large, an oppressed nation writ large, that is, oppressed on a national in addition to a class basis, it assumes the most regressive of attitudes. In fact, it does not have to be wholly successful for it to assume a reactionary posture. Its very character as a nationalism allows it to do so at any point. See, again, Iran. Insofar as this nationalism takes primacy over or obfuscates class forces, it acts in a historically retrogressive capacity. It facilitates the continued inability of a national bourgeois to carry out democratic revolution through excusing, justifying, and requiring an alliance with such bourgeois. What a despicable waste of time and energy for the class and the movement. To now touch ever so slightly on the historic question of the role of the nation during bourgeois revolution, we see here the nation in its most historically progressive sense, when it is neither practically nor historically obsolete. In facilitating the formation of distinct bourgeois state structures, an international capitalist economy, and a universal citizenry tied to a nation over any fiefdom, ruler, or plot of land as such, all three of course are intertwined, the nation-state served to accelerate and revolutionize the dance of history. Changes with the cementing state form, and thus of the national identity, and through, of course, the continued development of capitalism and imperialism, have brought about a change, of course, in the role and position of nationalism. Now, the state form is in many ways, that is, the bourgeois state form, the nation-state form, is in many ways a practical necessity for an imperialist world system that is wholly destructive, wholly exploitative, and at odds with every single goal of the communist movement. Nationalism cannot play a progressive role whatsoever in the imperial core, and plays a hesitantly, sclerotically, unevenly progressive one in the periphery, one that must be constantly agitated beyond by communists. To summarize, an unflinching internationalism requires an unflinching disloyalty to our own state, to the interests of our own nation as such. We are traitors through and through. Communist support for national liberation struggles is not support for nationalism, nor for the national bourgeoisie involved in such struggles. The weakness and uneven nature of the consciousness produced by a nationalism of the oppressed as the basis of consciousness must be exposed at every turn. And this must be done through an unrelenting commitment to lead democratic revolution, an unrelenting commitment to lead a national liberation as predicated upon and a necessary part of this democratic revolution. Communists, to pander slightly to our historic platypus hosts, must ring the international tocsin bell of the class. To arms, turn the guns around. The class is in danger, not of its demise, but of its perpetuation. Death to imperialism, death to nationalism, no borders, no nations, no class. Thank you, comrades.
Sorry, I'll be a bit flat. I stayed up all night because I didn't get my notes written, and they're 15 minutes long, so I will just spout them. Right now, we are living through days into which 20 years are compressed. There is a lot more to think about than in the slow decades from which the current dramatic speed up of history developed exponentially. The point of looking to the classics is to help think and develop some fresh new ideas. If instead you just look for quotes and slogans to reinforce your existing prejudices, you are part of the problem. I have an allergic reaction to the prompt for this panel on Lenin and the national question, which suggests that, quote, recent generations on the left have appropriated slogans that Lenin would have perceived as not proletarian but democratic. I won't try to respond with 10 minutes about what Lenin might think if he had not been dead for a century. But here is something from the Communist Manifesto section on proletarians and communists, perhaps relevant to whether communists reject slogans that are, quote, not proletarian but democratic. This is what the manifesto says. The first step in the revolution by the working class is to raise the proletariat, which means pretty well everybody these days, to the position of ruling class, to win the battle of democracy. The manifesto ends with, the communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Let the ruling classes tremble in the communistic revolution, the proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. There is some connection between forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions, becoming the ruling class, and winning the battle of democracy. They all involve, quote, the state. I recommend, as an introduction to that, a very short pamphlet by Lenin with that title. He did write another one on the national and social questions, and another one on Lenin's prediction of the revolutionary storms in the East. And here it is, the state. It's about 24 pages. I do recommend reading it. It's useful. If you want to follow up further in the foundations of Leninism, Stalin gives a chapter that's even shorter on the national question. The actual Leninist position on the national question, which was, I think, from what I could hear from Amal, was reasonably correctly presented. The classic version of it was first expressed by Stalin in Marxism and the National Question. It's so much the authoritative exposition of Leninism on the national question that Trotsky claimed Lenin must have written it, or should be given credit for having, sort of held Stalin's pen or something. But having done that, what we're interested in isn't what they would think, but what we're going to do. We're not a sect. We're not people who want to win people who are engaged in everyday life and everyday politics to the principles of Marxism and communism. That's not what revolutionary Democrats do, and there are no communists who are not revolutionary Democrats. We're part of a movement that wants to take power from the ruling classes and change the world. And it's not done that way. It's not done by convincing people of the principles of some, that they're supposed to adhere to. The question of the state that I recommended Lenin's book does connect then to the national question. States and nations get mixed up in very strange ways together. My view is that right now, what we should be putting forward is that it's the best time to establish global collective security. That is the embryo of a global state that was supposed to be established after the last World War. And if we don't succeed in getting effective global collective security, we will be faced with the next World War. Collective security can also, and I'll give you a quote here that I got from Peking Review issue number 2 of January 9, 1976, which was just before they got overthrown. Whether war gives rise to revolution or revolution prevents war, in either case, the international situation will develop in a direction favourable to the people, and the future of the world will be bright, so long as the world's people are prepared against the growing danger of war. Now, it's rather hard to ignore the fact that just in the last few months, suddenly millions of people around the world are talking about the danger of world war. And the central focus of that is in what's happening in Europe with Ukraine, in what's happening in Palestine with Gaza, and with what the various powers are saying may happen with a war in the Indo-Pacific between America and China. And to have a discussion about the national question while ignoring the question of world war and the total violation of all democratic rights that are going on in the major wars already being fought, and the total absence of democracy in the fascist powers that are preparing for a world war is pretty serious. Collective security can also be called solidarity. It's also what's done with things like insurance, that people collectively insure themselves. It's also what small bands of hominid apes do when they're fending off other hominid bands, right? People gather together for collective security. It's a daily part of life. It comes with the state before there was class society. The class society, the state came into existence with slavery, and slavery came into existence when we stopped killing captives in the wars between the predatory hominid bands that were fighting each other. You've got a necessity to have collective security, and the world currently lacks collective security. The alternative is to keep demanding that our rulers stop things getting worse until a world war leaves us no choice but to take power away from them. If we don't want a world war, it requires that the world's people act together to take power and govern the world themselves. The alternative to empty, pointless slogans that occupation is a crime is concrete proposals for military defeat of the occupiers. My proposal as a perspective for the current democratic world revolution could be summed up as: the world wants collective security, countries want independence, nations want liberation, the people want revolution, and information wants to be free. Unfortunately, there is nothing new in any part of that, but there needs to be. The term want has multiple connotations, with a natural transition from lack to need, to desire, to demand. Ultimately, it is the people that want to be free. We lack freedom, we need freedom, we desire freedom, we demand freedom, and we will fight for it. But the people is defined by its opposite, the enemies of the people. Some persons are grovelling slaves who won't fight for freedom. Some persons are oppressors and exploiters who want to stop people fighting for freedom. Some people are just empty windbags. I'll be writing a series of articles elaborating on the connections I see between various aspects of that perspective and what needs to be done right now to establish a system of collective security. And will link to them from updated versions of this 10-minute talk that will include detailed citations. Hopefully, critical responses will result in something newer and better. My proposal for actually getting to collective security is strongly based on the United Front strategies and the philosophy found behind them, found in Volume 1 of Mao's selected works, where he's discussing a united front to defeat Japanese imperialism in China that was formerly led by Chiang Kai-shek, and it did in fact not result in the victory of Chiang Kai-shek, but the victory of the revolution in China, which was subsequently defeated in pretty much a month after Mao died. It's been that defeat of the Chinese Revolution following the defeat of the Russian Revolution that occurred decades earlier was pretty much the end of the Leninist communist movement that had existed since the Russian Revolution. Right? The Soviet Union had started on the capitalist road in the early 60s. It had become a major fascist power. By 1969, it had invaded Czechoslovakia and forced military rule on Poland, and had inquired of the United States whether they would mind very much if they launched a nuclear attack on China. And fortunately, the Nixon administration replied that they would mind a lot, and actually, stop them from launching a nuclear attack on China. That fascist regime was not mourned by anybody in the world that was progressive when it collapsed and the USSR disintegrated into the constituent national states that had the right to secede from the first. And the first of those states that seceded was Russia, and it was followed by the others. The fact that we now have a revived Tsarist regime instead of a collection of bourgeois democracies in Russia is a pretty serious situation. It is an openly Tsarist regime. It simultaneously will maintain various propaganda organs, reviving Stalin, reviving the USSR, and so on, but their fundamental orientation is fascist and Tsarist. And if you look at China, I've got a decade ago, there was big debates on the Chinese opposition there, and most of them were following the anti-imperialist sort of politics that we get in Australia from people who claim to be the left here, and pushing the line that China needs to stand up more to imperialism and be more nationalist, and that the Chinese bourgeoisie has sold out to the foreigners and so on. And somebody called Qin Yuan, or using the name Qin Yuan, put forward this view, which I'll quote from a book called Revolution and Counter-Revolution, China's Continuing Class Struggle Since Liberation by Pao Yu-jin. And I'll give the reference Samaha. Qin claims that the CCP still has the alternative to nationalism, has the alternative to nationalise more industries and launch a Nazi-style nationalist socialism that can give even more political power to new dictators. A Nazi-style regime would be strongly promoted by fanaticism dressed up in the banner of patriotism, and putting all the blame for China's problems on a foreign conspiracy. Qin's point should be well taken, because there is a strong possibility the CCP could choose this alternative as a way of holding on to power. Now that was expressed clearly more than a decade ago. And
we'll just give you 5 more minutes, Arthur.
Sorry?
Just 5 more minutes.
Right, the 5 minutes. the history of the last decade has been one of the Chinese fascists really building a strong navy. They now have a larger navy than the American Navy. It will soon be more powerful than the American Navy, and they're getting very pushy. So I don't think one should ignore the view of the genuine Chinese left that regime has turned into a Nazi-style fascist, super fanatical, patriotic regime. I have particularly strong feelings about this because I was in China in May 1967, which was at the height of the Cultural Revolution. And the central problem was that the loyalist, people were called the loyalist Red Guards, or rather the royalist Red Guards, were super patriotic, super revolutionary, waving red flags and launching violent attacks on everybody in sight. I met with one of the top leaders. There were four little generals who were really well known nationally as the Red Guard leadership. One of them was, I can't pronounce her name properly, but Tan Halan. She was the one with pigtails. And we had really good conversations and definitely felt on the same wavelength. When the fascists took power, in 1977, they sentenced tens of thousands of them, including Tan Halan, to death immediately. They didn't actually execute them immediately. I read later that she died of cancer. But she did make me an honorary member of the Shinkansen Red Guards, Shinkansen Commune at Beijing Normal University, despite the fact that I was a tourist who doesn't even speak Chinese. And I still feel very strongly that the genuine Red Guards who were fighting to overthrow the capitalist roaders in China, who were in power in a lot of places throughout China, including the top party leadership in China, they were fighting very seriously politically, and the fascists that they were fighting back very violently. And it was a complicated struggle, but the danger of the kind of fascists that were fought in the Cultural Revolution, who did end up winning and who are now in power, the danger of them becoming a Nazi-like regime with a program of conquest seems to me pretty real and very comparable to the situation with the Russian regime. That there really isn't much choice if you're a fascist regime in Russia and you have Ukrainians who speak Russian right next door, joining Europe, advancing much more rapidly in a modern direction. You can't really maintain an autocracy in Russia. They all speak Russian, they have family connections. You really can't tolerate a democratic, modern Western regime in Ukraine side by side with a backward Tsarist autocracy run by kleptocratic gangsters in Russia. Likewise, I don't think that China can tolerate the fact that the Kuomintang regime in Beijing, which now exists, it's a nationalist regime of the sort that Chiang Kai-shek had, is faced with a democratic regime in Taiwan that is doing much better than they are. And I think they will feel that it's vitally important to crush that regime, and Singapore and anywhere else where there's large Chinese minorities that speak Chinese and are living a better life than the people around under the fascists in China. I think that's pretty important. And I've got distractions from anything else that was in my paper, but I want to recommend to you that if you are intent on studying the history of Lenin's position on the national question, I will put up the rest of these notes. and it does include a reference to a paper I wrote that was about 50 pages with more than 50 detailed references and footnotes in response to the main Albanian polemic against Maoism, which relied heavily on quotations from Lenin and Stalin to show that the Maoist line that the Maoist regime in China had been following should instead have been the sort of line that I think Anthony was expressing, that a much more militantly ultra-left, we are blah, blah, blah. That was the Albanian position, and it had a lot of appeal to Maoists because that's where we're coming from being the hard left of the in opposition to the revisionist Communist Party in Australia. But it was fake. They actually were capitulating to Soviet fascism, and we wrote a detailed analysis of it, which I'm still quite proud of. You can find it at the Errol Archives. That's the encyclopedia. It's supposed to be the Encyclopedia of Anti-Revisionism online, but they named it EROL. It's a section of the Marxist.org. They have a page on anti-revisionism in Australia, and that's got a section of the Red Eureka movement, which, by the way, I wasn't the founder. I was the only one authorised to be a public speaker. And by the way, I wasn't a member of the Communist Party Marxist-Leninist. Nobody was allowed to announce that they were a member of the Communist Party Marxist-Leninist. The only information claiming that I was is that they announced that we'd all expelled ourselves when we refused to go along with their views on what was happening.
All right, we'll wrap up there then. Go on to Isaac now.
Sorry?
We'll just wrap it up there.
Okay, I'll wrap it up there, and I'll repeat that I messed up and didn't prepare proper notes, and I apologise for that, but I will put it online.
Thanks,
And the links to find it online, David's distributed his red spec copies here. I think they're sitting on the table. He's got an address that you can use to find a copy of it online.
Thanks, Amal. I will attempt to be brief. I think a lot of stuff has been covered already as far as giving some background on Lenin. I think the angle that I also kind of have a bit of disparate notes, but I will be as concise as possible. I think that when I first was given the prompt, it was again, I think it was said in classic clavicle style. It's like 15 questions really. So I was thinking to break it down into a few things I think would be a fruitful discussion. One of the things is the way that Lenin has haunted the world as far as the national question goes. He has not just haunted the left. The language of self-determination that Lenin took up was very much also in parallel to the language of the Wilsonian liberals at the same time, or thereabouts, who also took up this language of the universal right of nations of self-determination. And that legacy has obviously continued under the American regime with their adoption of it to their own strategic ends. It was mentioned in the prompt that the adoption of the right of nations self-determination by Lenin was a strategic one, and that is true. It's the same for the ruling class as well. The imperialists are also big fans of the right of nations self-determination, turns out. I wanted to talk a bit about also the part that's less strategic when it comes to this issue of self-determination, because that word is brushed over a lot. I think people just have this general vague idea that self-determination is like, just vague freedom, bro. It's not particularly well defined, but obviously it has a history, and so I would like to briefly get into the history a little bit. Before I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. Again, I do apologize for the notes. But when we talk about the national question is a question. And a question was prompted by objective circumstances in history. And it's related to and parallel with the social question. So the national question, much like the social question was for Marx and Engels, it pre-existed Lenin's foray into the matter. Both questions, social and national, were not self-originating, coming from the ideas of these very bright thinkers, but only came into being owing to the hitherto stable social forms of feudalism and the old world, becoming destabilized by capitalist modernity. The revolutionary class struggle of the proletariat was entangled with the existing Republican movement at the time of Marx, and it can trace its genealogy to it. This is the left before the left. It's the left before the late 19th century, which was synonymous with democratic republicanism. The Republican roots of European socialism were firstly ethical imperatives as far as the intellectuals who were articulating them. Mostly Kant. Kantianism is perhaps the real shadow of discussions about self-determination. Marx and later Lenin did not necessarily rebuke this Republican impulse, but instead historicized it. Arthur was quite right in saying that a huge component of Marx's program was about winning the nation, about the battle for democracy, etc. And obviously, social democracy was the original term for socialism and communism. The insight of scientific socialism, in contrast with the sort of ethical nationalist imperatives, this romantic view, was that freedom, or self-determination, they are synonyms, is merely insight into necessity. Socialism from this vantage point cannot be reduced to the ethical dimension, but rather seen within a broader development of history itself. The self-consciousness of the historical nature of freedom would then lead to its actual fulfillment. This is the reason why nationalism is problematic. A naive and romantic nationalism covers itself in the veil of freedom, but is wholly deficient precisely because it's the veil itself is what blinded it, and it ultimately produces unfreedom. I also think that when we talk about nationalism, Lenin's view in particular, and the relationship between his notion of the national question and the right of nations to self-determination is inseparable from his self-determination is inseparable from his internationalism, which Nick was mentioned obviously earlier. And this is to say that this nationalism is internationalism. It's not transnationalism, it's not anti-nationalism. Mutual recognition is the key to internationalism. It is solidarity between nations, particularly the proletariat. And it's not the supersession of nations. The fraternity desired by Lenin in the global context of the class struggle was only possible by establishing trust in the other. A way to think about this is as relationships between individuals. As individuals, according to the Enlightenment logic, we each have a right to self-determine and not be dominated and subjected by the whims of another, especially arbitrary whims of another. If one party refuses to recognize the freedom of the other, there is mutual unfreedom. Here is just the reappearance of Hegel's master-slave dialectic, of course. So for Lenin, the right of nations to self-determination is not merely a strategic means to an end, but is deeply embedded within Enlightenment thought, although not identical with it. The continuity between the old democratic Republican tradition is not after all superseded by Lenin, but is rather fulfilled globally in the age of capitalist imperialism. Which then leads us to the other part that's not been mentioned so far, which is Lenin's contribution related to self-determination, and he's also his theory about imperialism. And imperialism being synonymous with Lenin with finance capital. This is a little quote from Lenin which might be, you ground those two things and marry them in a way that makes sense. Finance capital, in its striving towards expansion, will freely buy and bribe the freest, most democratic and republican government and the elected officials of any country. However independent it may be. The domination of finance capital as of capital in general, cannot be abolished by any kind of reforms in the realm of political democracy, and self-determination belongs wholly and exclusively to this realm. The domination of finance capital, however, does not in the least destroy the significance of political democracy as a freer, wider, and more distinct form of class oppression and class struggle. I think this brings together actually a few points that were raised earlier. I think that it is neither a view, Lenin's view is neither a view of one-sided opposition to self-determination and political democracy in this whole Enlightenment project. But it is neither this sort of, it's neither naive to the fact that political democracy is not the way that of resolving the contradiction between capital and labour. Now, just to wrap it up, because I realise that we've all been having this talk for a while, I wanted to bring this completely down to the Australian context, for example. So, in the Australian context, we have a lot of competing views about the national question. I think the most dominant one is the national question in Australia is sort of spoken in, I guess, academic post-colonial register, and that's mostly where it's relegated to. Obviously, you have old, sort of the old communists, the old CPA, Amal, those types who have a bit more of the view of there being a relevance to Australia as a battleground for democracy, and there being a need for independence of Australia from US imperialism, for example. But I think this is where Lenin can actually be very useful to us as Australians who are wanting to fight for our own independence from capital, to say, the fight of proletariat. We need to, I think, critically examine the way that we are approaching this issue in our own particular context. Because as workers or as intellectuals in Australia, in our particular circumstances, there is a dire dearth of attention given to the national question in our context, especially as regards to the contradiction between city and country, for example, the uneven development that typifies Australia in its financialised hollowed out existence. So I think I will leave it there. I'm curious to further the dialogue. So yeah, I think that'll work for now.
We'll now go back to Amal for 5 minutes to 7 minutes of response to the panelists.
Sure. So yeah, I agreed with much of the latter part of Anthony's talk about how our relationship to nationalisms are conditional, tactical, a tactical relationship. I disagreed with something you said at the start, which was that we don't really need unity around these complicated questions of support for various non-communist national movements overseas. And this is a fitting thing for us to disagree on, because in 1916 Lenin calls this question the main difference between communists and social democrats. When we talk about support, we do not mean political support for nationalists. We mean practical support in wars and against state oppression. So the question of support is forced upon you by the world, whether or not you want to unite around it. To intervene in the class struggle in any meaningful way raises questions of how we use any power and influence that we gain in the workers' movement. Do we tell workers to let Israeli war material through the ports? What about arms headed for a war on China, or for a national liberation movement in Kanaki or elsewhere? These are questions not covered simply by saying that we are disloyal to our own state. It requires unity on internationalism. Otherwise, RCO members will end up on opposite sides of important demonstrations and picket lines. Arthur, I agree with what you said about the prompt being wrong on this question. You know, there is not a contradiction between democratic and proletarian demands. You know, any serious Marxists know that our struggle begins with both democratic and economic demands. if we don't care about democratic demands, then we are basically saying we don't care about state oppression, racial or familial laws, or saying that we don't care that we're still subject to the king who lives in a palace. Our program includes whatever democratic demands still have force in people's minds, but links them to the need for revolution. I disagree that our job right now is not to win people to a quite specific set of ideas. We had a conversation in the hall about an obscure political economist writing in 1928. These questions clearly have importance to you and to me, because you have some sense that these are the questions of revolutionary leadership. I have no doubt that in any actual social revolution, relatively few people will know much Lenin, but the organic leaders will probably know it. Those conversations can start today, and in fact the best use of our time while we're very small is to try and have these conversations. We cannot place hope that anyone of the oppressed will automatically come to the quite specific politics needed for liberation. There could not be a better illustration for that need for a quite precise use of terms like fascism and democracy than to say that Russia and China are both fascist and that we need to support whatever states are opposed to them. Isaac, I suppose the quote that stood out to me was the idea that imperialists also love self-determination. It's very simple. Democratic demands have a different content depending on who you propose will carry them out. One core of Lenin's politics is that only working class power can carry out, complete and protect democratic freedoms. Obviously, imperialists do appeal to democracy cynically, inconsistently, etc. One example of this is the cynical mobilization of the language of self-determination by liberal imperialism. One example of the cynical mobilization of the language of self-determination or independence by liberal imperialism is to say that Australia is an oppressed colony of the US. I don't think that there is any benefit in saying that an independent Australian imperialism would be better than United States imperialism. That's all.
Thank you, comrade. I'll start off with actually addressing one of the comments Amal just made on something I said at the start and the disagreement there. Yeah, I think I didn't get a chance, unfortunately, because I wrote my notes poorly, to clarify what I meant by the statement. I think in general terms, I would frame it in terms of we do not need a precise, narrow, theoretical framework for questions of support or non-support. And by that I mean, say, the sub-questions of whether or not one considers China socialist or state capitalist, etc., and how that bears upon the notion of, say, support for or non-support for war with China in those sort of critical moments of the displays of the national question. I unfortunately did not touch upon it in much detail. I think the question of disloyalty to our own state does in fact cover much of the struggles mentioned also, such as the Russia-Ukraine question, or the Palestine question, or the China question. To the extent that I think the important dividing line is between those who support the continued interest and extension of the interests of the Australian imperialist ambitions and Australia's position in the imperialist world order. So, of course, war with China, the continuation of weapons and arms shipments to Ukraine, the continuation of genocide in Palestine, those sort of questions. That's what I would consider perhaps the definitive dividing line. I think there is generally perhaps also a need to supplement this with the principle of disloyalty with a general support for the best possible conditions for democratic struggle and national liberation internationally, insofar as these are the best possible conditions for the overthrow of an imperialist world order from which our state benefits. So I think you mentioned the question of Kanaki, and that also falls under that to me. But I think I take on the disagreement nonetheless. In terms of Amal's speech overall, I appreciate the acknowledgement of Kautsky's position and importance in developing the national question. I think I would dispute the extent of the established sort of 14 break in terms of between the classical positions of social democracy on the national question and Lenin's own. But I do, I think Lenin's development on the on the question of imperialism quite clearly precedes and supplements the development on the national question. I think that's sort of undeniable. So I agree with that. I also think that one should nevertheless consider the Marxist preference or the social democrat preference for large multinational states as relevant and critical where possible. Should consider such a preference lively and ongoing. I think there is still an argument to be made that these large multinational states, in terms of the seizure of state power by a proletariat, are essentially the best tactical conditions for that seizure. That being said, of course, this needs to be supplemented by an understanding that the creation of these states cannot be done at the expense of cementing exploitative national boundaries or a repression of movements for self-determination, an undemocratic repression of those movements. Let's see, what else? You also mentioned the sort of release valve of the 20th century for agitational forces for self-determination in terms of the creation of neo-colonial as opposed to directly colonial relations, or the semi-freedom conditions. We want to clarify, of course, that this doesn't end the task of national liberation itself. An objective material basis for a nation's wholesale exploitation continues. One must acknowledge national liberation and self-determination remain critical tasks of proletarian democratic revolution, although I think ones that can only be established through international struggle. To move on to Arthur's talk, I think that I appreciate the centrality of the state to Arthur's remarks, and I agree that the point of reading classics is often to produce and stimulate innovations and developments in thought and the application of Marxist strategy as opposed to rehash particular phrasings and slogans from the 20th century and before. I was rather intrigued by the positioning of collective security, semantically speaking, and sort of had a few questions around what we mean by this security and how any sustainable period of security could be actually achieved in a capitalist order. And also the continued use of phrases such as the people want to be free or the enemies of the people, I would also find disputable, considering the semantic vagueness of those terms and their sort of abstraction. When we're talking about a united front strategy for the attainment of collective security, I'd also say that the example mentioned by Arthur with Chiang Kai-shek is, I find it historically interesting. I'd be more inclined to call it a popular front, but I also think it was, quite frankly, I won't get too much into these debates, but it seems to me quite clearly an example of a combination of historical fluke and Mao's recognition that it was an abject strategic futility, sort of Mao's recognition of the need for a break with this strategy of a popular front, which sort of contributed to the success, the so-called success of that strategy in the first place, of the united front, as you mentioned. I think the problem of Russia is also a quintessential example of the utility and centrality of nationalism itself as ideology to an autocratic bureaucracy and its allegiance with a national bourgeoisie, or perhaps a national bourgeoisie directly, and without necessarily an autocratic bureaucracy, even in nations that aren't clearly determined as within the imperial core, such as I think Russia would be, as in not clearly determined within that imperial core. And I also appreciate the critique of my position as ultra-left. I don't think Soviet fascism exists, even if I believed it had. I don't believe that it... Whoopsie. I don't believe that it does anymore, and I don't think there's anything left for a so-called ultra-left position on nationalism to capitulate to in the first place. To move finally on to Isaac, I appreciated the acknowledgement, I think, of the Wilsonian liberal sort of right of nations and the Leninist right of nations. I agree with Amal in that they demonstrably differ significantly in practice and in content. Of course, their application is significantly different, and I think the point of the necessity of democratic struggle and the struggle for national liberation in Lenin being carried forth by a working class movement as opposed to a cross-class movement is quite a significant point of differential there. I also appreciate the acknowledgement actually of the Republican movement and its influence on Marx and Engels' democratic republicanism. I like to style myself as a social democrat. The historicization and scientific application of the struggle for democratic republic or a social republic is certainly central to Marxist thought, and I think plays a key role in understanding the position of national liberation and self-determination generally. I think when you mentioned enlightened thought, I think not identical with, that part is important to emphasize here. I don't think a mutual recognition of nations is a sufficient basis for internationalism as such, and I would actually say that an internationalism aspires to a supersession of nations, but that's perhaps my ultra-leftism. I think imperialism also is not synonymous for Lenin purely with finance capital. I think you gave a good lengthy quote on that, but the key representative here I think should be monopoly capital more generally. Finance capital often steers and develops this, it is true, but it doesn't play the singular role. And in terms of Australia as a battleground for democracy, this battleground necessitates class independence. A working class movement is the only movement capable of truly winning and carrying out to the end the struggle for democracy itself. The Australian bourgeoisie, just as any particular national bourgeoisie, particularly those within an imperial core, are wholly complicit within the imperialist world order it finds itself in and benefit continuously from its perpetuation. I think, again, when we talk about countries perhaps within an imperial periphery, there's often a tendency to want to excuse from criticism or exempt from criticism the national bourgeoisie or the bourgeoisie of these nations, of these states, precisely because they are fighting against the current instantiation of the imperialist world order in some sense or another. I think it's true that we can recognise this, and we can recognise limited fields for tactical cooperation and collaboration where goals align and where strategic interests meet. I think, of course, also, though, the necessity of communists to consistently and unrelentingly call out the undeveloped or unevenly developed nature of the national bourgeoisie struggle for national liberation, for democracy is of critical import. They will make, of course, consistent nod to democracy, to national liberation, to self-determination, but when it comes time to carry out those goals to the very end, they will find themselves unable to do so.
Do we want to wrap up?
Yep, I'm done.
We might do Isaac first, just because he has to leave soon. If that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to skip you up. Yeah, I do apologise. I have to go to work. Problematic, as they say. Anyway, I just want to first of all thank you guys for having me speak. It's an honour. Thank you for this. I wanted to clarify that I wasn't saying that Australia needs we need Australian imperialism like that. Someone was missing translation. I was just saying that there's an incomplete democratic struggle in Australia, that's all. And that it can only be led by the workers. That's only the working class can actually follow through in the democratic struggle. So just wanted to clarify that because it might have been lost in translation. I just wanted to also appreciate, I mentioned it in my talk, but the grounding Lenin's sort of development of his thought, I thought that was actually very, very good. I think it tracks on quite strongly. I also think that the tendency to, I suppose, quote mine, I think even Arthur mentioned this, can be dangerous, obviously. And even you kind of almost called me out there with the bit about finance capital. Just I wasn't trying to say like it's purely finance capital, just that it's inseparable. Obviously, people often talk about imperialism in its ethical term, as I was speaking about the sort of Kantian element of the discourse around self-determination. So people reduce it to this very ethical dimension of oppression and oppress and all this stuff. And this is not really the domain. This is not really where Lenin's relevant. Lenin's relevant sort of after the ethical step that was made in the Enlightenment and the Romantics. Lenin's and Marx's contribution in scientific socialism is more so to look at the historical development that produces the necessity of freedom and self-determination. I don't really have much else to say. I do have to run. But thank you, Platypus. Thank you guys. You've all been very, very insightful, and hopefully you can do this again. Thank you.
We'll finish off the responding remarks with Arthur.
Okay. Firstly, I think Amal said that she agrees with the characterisation of both Russia and China as fascist.
No.
Or not?
No.
I was surprised, so I did misunderstand. Okay, so to me that is a really fundamental question. That when I've advertised the article at Errol that I wrote under the name Alan Ward on Three Worlds, in which the one thing I know that I got wrong was that I characterised the Albanian position as ultra-left, and that they should be treated as comrades who are making a left mistake. And shortly afterwards I corrected that because it was quite clear that they weren't left at all. And I've got a suspended judgment about Anthony. I made a point of sending him a link to that article because I did correct it later, that some people who sound ultra-left end up turning out to be far right. And if you stick with the position that Russia and China are not fascist dangers to democracy of all kinds, to any kind of revolutionary struggle and so on, you are ending up on the far right. The current defensist position of saying we're not on either side of this imperialist war is pretty close to the MAGA position. That's Trump's position, right? That's what he says. You know, it's the killing's got to stop. We just want a frozen conflict in Ukraine. It's an ordinary right-wing conservative position, but if you really don't fight fascism, you end up on the far right. So that's first thing. One thing I'm pretty sure I did get right from what Amal was saying was that national liberation is less central now than it was in Lenin's time, and certainly in Mao's time, but it's still relevant. And I would endorse that, but would like to emphasise the relevance that throughout my political life, which is from when I was 14, which is 70 years ago, or more than 70 years ago, I was Secretary of Youth Against Apartheid, and apartheid no longer exists in South Africa. It's not a revolutionary socialist regime, but it was defeated by an armed struggle and with the assistance of a serious economic sanctions carried out by the major capitalist powers that encouraged the apartheid regime to accept defeat. And it arranged for, instead of a very bloody transfer of power, it arranged for a relatively peaceful transfer of power. I doubt that the same thing will happen with Palestine, but definitely the moves that are happening for a worldwide movement that is calling for sanctions and criminal prosecutions and so on because of what's happening to the destruction of Palestine, will end up not with the individual boycotts and individual sanctions of individual projects within a country or small countries doing. It will end up with the European Union imposing a serious economic blockade that will have a serious effect on that long-term regime. But for the short-term question of whether a couple of million Palestinians are going to be evicted from Palestine, armed intervention is required. It's not going to be done by a sanctions process. You know, the apartheid struggle took a long time to actually end the apartheid regime. Ending the apartheid regime in the 1967 territories of Israel will take a long time. They're pretty well armed, right? But if you want to stop the expulsion of Palestinians from Gaza right now and from the West Bank quite soon, you need an armed force to intervene in the Eastern Mediterranean, perhaps turn up with 3 carrier task force and blockade the Straits of Gibraltar in case the Americans get some strange idea that they should turn up too and help protect Israel from the terrorists. But if the Turks are willing, they've got an army in Syria now, because thanks to Comrade Netanyahu, he destroyed Hezbollah, which had made the very big mistake of supporting a fascist regime in Syria, which thoroughly and totally discredited the Hezbollah from any Palestinian support, but the Hezbollah was wiped out, the Russian support for Assad was rather weakened by the fact that they were still fighting in Ukraine, and that Syrian regime, which the Europeans and Americans wanted there to help protect Assad from the Sunni revolt Sunni Arab revolt in Syria, finally went. So they subjected the Syrian people to 10 years of absolute fascist oppression, including the use of chemical warfare against them and so on. But after 10 years, thanks to Comrade Netanyahu, the Syrian regime is gone, right? Now, that's something interesting. We can't complain that it's a bourgeois, regime replacing it. It's a bloody jihadi that's replacing it, right? They're not very particularly democratic, they're not particularly progressive, but they're a lot better than the bloody fascists that were running Syria before. And there's now a Turkish army in Syria as well. And the Kurdish problem is being resolved, that the PKK, which has disbanded and will be integrated into the Syrian system. The result could be that the Turks do end up, they've got one of the largest armies, navies and air forces in Europe. They could be quite willing to take on a confrontation over Gaza, right, and just say stop it. But they need support from some other countries, because the Zionist regime would fight if it was just the Turks. But if it was the Turks accompanied by a French carrier fleet and a British carrier fleet and even an Italian carrier fleet, I don't think the Israeli regime would fight. I think they'd just say, okay, we won in Gaza. I mean, they've destroyed Gaza completely already. We'll leave it to you guys. It's your problem now. And somebody should do that. That's called collective security, right? And it's not a revolutionary proletarian socialist demand. It doesn't wait for the victory of world revolution. It says we want armed forces now to stop crap that the whole world regards as intolerable. Thank you.
We can even have questions of the audience. Yeah.
This microphone might die at some point.
This is a question for Anthony. We used the word imperial core a couple of times. Would you say the West is the main problem in the world?
Should I answer now? I think the West is sort of a less defined criteria perhaps than imperial core. And I think sort of interrogating both that and main problem. I think the main problem is capitalism, of which imperialism is not the highest stage, but one of the most developed, and one of a core expression of a continued international extractive system of production. So I think the current, what the main problem is not which imperial bloc, whether it's the West, whether it's some other bloc that rises to supersede or overtake it in the coming, say, decades. The main problem is not the particular imperialist bloc, but the system which relies upon and, in fact, creates and cultivates and supports these blocs, these imperialist blocs, and the division of the world into, as comrades from, say, Renan are fond of saying, oppress and oppress nations. Perhaps I think a little too vague of an analysis, but it's from Lenin, so who can really argue with that? That's my short answer on that question, but I think there's a lot to discuss there.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. I wanted to know to what extent the speakers regard the nation as a quote-unquote democratic category. Is there well, what is the difference between liberation and freedom when we think of these terms in terms of democracy? And is there some continuity between nationalism as a project for the left today and the American and French revolutions? Do you want to take that?
Could you repeat that last one?
Yeah, sure. Is there some continuity between the national projects that the left might take up today and the tradition or the legacy of the American and French revolutions?
If you're interested in that one.
Sure. So I don't really know what it would mean for a nation to be part of a democratic category. I would say that a nation is both an objective, can be an objective economic reality, but only when combined with a sort of subjective, a subjective consciousness of its existence.
Can you clarify the question? Sorry,
Yeah.
I don't want to confuse anyone. What I was kind of thinking of when I was saying that was I was thinking of the ABC ideas and the idea of we are the third estate, the nation being like the people, the democratic majority. So I was kind of like assuming that broader framework, if that helps clarify.
Yeah, now I understand better what you mean. Yeah. I suppose it would be, but yeah, I tend not to think so much in these terms, I guess. As for liberation versus freedom, I guess in the context of talking about national liberation, it does mean something much more specific than freedom. Freedom being, I guess, a more general bourgeois democratic value, which doesn't necessarily have many concrete programmatic implementations in our thought, but yeah, national liberation meaning, that process of a revolutionary war that Lenin talks about in his later work of, overcoming imperialism through supporting anti-colonial revolutions and things like this. And a national project, I mean, I think that Lenin talks about national projects, which I think that there is a good little bit here. I wonder if Anthony, do you want to talk about it while I find that thing?
Which one am I talking about? Sorry.
Just any parts of the questions, because it was both to all of us.
Yeah, actually, I did I was going to jump in earlier when you mentioned the distinction between freedom and liberation. I think I quite profoundly agree with Amal in terms of the programmatic implications that an understanding of liberation, specific, strategic, and limited in scope necessarily, has compared to a value for freedom. I think you can argue that both, in any sense, or any broad sense, can only be partial when an international system of capital continues, insofar as national liberation, one, it refers to the nation, I think, quite objectively as the economic unit, and refers quite objectively to the conditions needed for some semblance of an independent nation. Of course, there can be no truly independent nation when all nations are tied together necessarily and fundamentally by a capitalist world order, etc., etc. So it is in some ways a sort of limited in scope, or perhaps limited in demand by the conditions that give rise to the demand in the first place. I think in terms of the French Revolution and the American Revolution, the aspect I think is most perhaps inspiring and extended by communists, the emancipatory aspects, I think is the sort of the aspiration to universalism, which takes form most concretely in the idea of citizenship and citizenry. I like Bruno Leopold's work, Citizen Marx, on the question of the Democratic Republic and the Republican influence. I think the sort of, again, I'd say the Republican tradition of those revolutions is the one where you find the most lay through with communist organizing and strategy today. That's a broad answer, yeah.
I found the bit I was talking about, if it's okay. Yeah. On the question of a national project, nation building, these kinds of things, Lenin says, combat all national oppression? Yes, of course. fight for any kind of national development, for national culture in general? Of course not. The economic development of capitalist society presents us with concrete examples of immature national movements all over the world. Examples of the formation of big nations out of a number of small ones, or to the detriment of some of the small ones, and also examples of the assimilation of nations. The development of nationality in general is the principle of bourgeois nationalism, hence the exclusiveness of bourgeois nationalism, hence the endless national bickering. The proletariat, however, far from undertaking to uphold the national development of every nation, on the contrary, warns the masses against such illusions, stands for the fullest freedom of capitalist intercourse, and welcomes any kind of assimilation of nations, except that which is founded on force and privilege. So he does at points talk about a national movement having some kind of progressive character. Mostly he's talking about it historically, in the sort of like the bourgeois democratic revolutions. But he's not saying that there's much continuity in a kind of national project that we support here.
If I could jump in quickly there, I was just reminded of that passage by an excellent talk I recently listened to from a comrade at Marxist Workday down here in Melbourne on China's premature slowdown in terms of economic development and the potentials there for essentially a crisis in terms of rate of profit, etc. You know, the boring political economy stuff, just kidding, it's very important. But I think there's sort of, you know, Lenin's quite prescient there in terms of pointing out the struggle, the social struggle is not the struggle for national development as such, and it's not the sort of, the developmentalist road that I think, if we're talking about a national project, both culturally but also significantly economically now, that some socialists propose as even being possible in the first place, I think quite clearly is not, demonstrably is not. But, you know, there's this constant struggle by a national bourgeoisie, by a developmentalist bourgeoisie and state to you know, work themselves out of, say, a periphery or semi-periphery position. And I think that's one that communists should oppose ideologically and practically speaking as being essentially impossible. So, yeah.
I'd want to comment on this discussion.
Yeah.
It's a perfect illustration of the enthusiasm with which two of the speakers here welcome such a question that can allow one to pontificate about what Lenin said about this and that and the other, and completely ignore the fact that we are living through days in which 20 years of events are happening. That's how fast things are moving now. That's how irrelevant the pseudo-left in Australia, and especially its hardcore, ultra-left Marxist-Leninist vanguard, they're totally irrelevant to what's actually happening in the world, and you'd really much rather discuss this kind of shit than talk about what we're going to do about Palestine, what we're going to do about Ukraine, or what we're going to do about anything. You're irrelevant to politics in the 21st century. Thank you.
All right, Neil.
Yeah, I'm from Panelists. Just to take up on that, listen, as the US empire lashes out, I've got a question for two of the speakers. As the US empire lashes out to arrest its declining hegemony, the oppressed countries of the global south face being crushed and bled dry. This will spark social explosions, but which direction will it go? The fight for national emancipation is a mighty lever for revolutionary struggle to overthrow this imperialist system. As Leninists, we are for pushing forward this struggle, counterposing a proletarian strategy to that of the national bourgeoisies. Nowhere is this more urgent than the struggle for Palestinian liberation. Israel's war of extermination in Gaza was recently extended to Iran. There, it was necessary to defend Palestine and Iran against US imperialism and their Zionist attack dog. Unfortunately, most leftists failed this test. Capitulating to pro-imperialist liberals and Labourites, they mimicked pacifist calls to end the war. The RCO's call, "No war with Iran," is an example. refusal to side with Iran, now, was often motivated by fear of being seen to strengthen its repressive regime. Defending Iran doesn't mean politically supporting its regime. What most strengthens Iran's rulers is for leftists to stand aside when the country is being attacked and bombed. That leaves the Mullah regime to posture as the only anti-imperialists. I think we here all know the regime cannot defend Iran. You just have to look at everything that's happened since October 7th. But you're never going to be able to mobilise the oppressed masses, that is those that do have the social power, to drive imperialism from the region, if you cannot even defend their country against the imperialists. Now, the organisation that Amal represents, the IBT, called to defend Iran and to defeat Israel's war drive. Good. But this is belied by their position on Palestine, where they obscure the distinction between oppressed and oppressor nations, rejecting the fight for Palestinian national liberation because it can only come at the supposed expense of Jewish national rights. Instead, therefore, pure class struggle, revolution. Well, how are you going to get that if you don't champion Palestinian national liberation, which is the only way to win over the Palestinian masses and to break Israeli workers from Zionism? The IBT over Iran said block the bombs, shut down the ports. Again, great. But this can only be made real by exposing the Friends of Palestine Union bureaucrats who block with the supporters of genocide. And this is something neither the RCO nor the IBT do. So a question to both these two groups. In imperialist countries, if you don't struggle against the obstacles to real union action by fighting to split the working class from their leadership, pro-imperialist, social chauvinist leaders, isn't that simply betraying the struggle for national liberation of neo-colonies?
Can I ask a quick follow-up question? Is there anyone here that thinks it matters what either of the two groups that he's asking about,
Yes,
or his
Madam
group,
does.
think
Madam
about
does.
any of these questions?
Does
Does anyone think it matters?
Yeah.
Yes. Anyone think it doesn't matter? Okay, I'm totally isolated. It doesn't matter what they think.
No, let's go to the head.
So yeah, the ICL is very fond of saying that national liberation or democratic demands in general is the lever or motive force for revolution. And I agree in a very specific sense. I agree in that adopting these demands for national liberation in different contexts where they're applicable, in adopting democratic demands into a transitional program, you do build the forces for revolution and by appealing to where consciousness is at now and trying to link it to the need for revolution. I agree in that very specific sense. I think that what the ICL tends to mean by this formula is something a bit more than that. That you have to, in any situation, you have to first go through building up national liberationism as a distinct force. You have to first build up the democratic struggle as a distinct force, and this will get you enough support in the class to then start talking about class struggle. And this is the sense in which I disagree. I think that you raised your recent supplemental on Iran. I agree with a lot of what it's saying about the other groups in there. I think that the slogan of stop the war, or what the CPGB came out with, which was defend the peoples of Iran. I think that these are obfuscations of the politics at stake. I think that the thing that is actually defending people from Israeli bombs is not the Iranian people. The Iranian people do not have a military force in this. It is the Iranian state. And I support the overthrow of the Iranian state. I do not think this is in contradiction with saying that it should be able to defend itself against Israel and the US. I think that and we have this caricature of the interpenetrated people's position as, oh no, we can't do national liberation for the Palestinians because then they might do a genocide against the Israelis or something like this. That's not what interpenetrated peoples is. In fact, your position is still largely drawn from interpenetrated peoples. It's simply that Israelis have national rights, Israeli Jews have national rights, and that these are relevant when trying to work out how to fight for Palestinian liberation. Obviously, the Palestinians are more oppressed than the Israeli Jews. But this, in just emphasizing national liberationism in your program doesn't really add much content to it. You haven't fully broken with interpenetrated peoples. You've just started adopting this caricature of it as, that we can't do a Palestinian national liberation yet. Obviously, it's on the agenda. Obviously, we do need to fight for this liberation. It's just that we need to do it as part of a united socialist federation of the Middle East, which would include the right of Jews to live there, the right of Palestinians to live there as well. That's all.
I'll answer quickly because I need to go to the bathroom, so please, any questions for me after this, save them, keep your hands down, I know it might be hard. I think pretty much the only note I wrote down for this is that just clarifying that I actually I take the weekly worker, CPGB, whatever position of siding with the Iranian people. It was called an obfuscation earlier. I think in some ways that's fair. I think in the sense that it's less clear, there certainly isn't an independent Iranian people that exists as a force, political force, a substantial objective political force, separate from the Iranian state in any meaningful capacity. I think part of the phrasing is aspirational in the sense that, the point to me is to distinguish between a state which we clearly, in the main, cannot and do not support, and between a people who we believe have the right to self-defense and to defend against imperialist aggression and war. I don't think either that the phrasing of no war with Iran implies that Iran does not have any sort of, right to defend itself. I think it's sort of a recognition of the fact that in the sense of a sustained or coherent framework for support, we do not possess one for the Iranian state, the Mullah regime. I had something else to say. I don't really have much to, of course I don't have much to comment on in terms of the interpenetrated people stuff because it's not a framework that the RCO adopts cohesively or as an organisation. I do think that a lot of the points raised by the interpenetrated peoples, I'm sympathetic to, in fact, the reason for the adoption of this framework, and particularly in the case of Palestine and Israeli Jews. But I think the question there can sort of be, and I'm sure Amal would be aware of the writings in the Weekly Worker by related to Machova, and I think the question there can be resolved partly by an application of the democratic rights and for peoples to to self-determination and to national liberation as such. And I think his writing is good on addressing the need for a secular state which grants Jews in Israel the right to self-determination, but also the fact that a working class movement is the only movement that can achieve such a state in any meaningful sense. That is about. I don't think it's an obfuscation. I also don't think it's a particularly a betrayal to the cause of national liberation as such. I think the whole reason for saying side with the people as opposed to side with the Iranian state is because the Iranian state itself is incapable of carrying out, I'm very critical of the Iranian state for a number of reasons. First, I could appeal to a whole bunch of course, repressive, reactionary ideals, etc. But I think first and foremost, in fact, I would say the failure to carry out a national liberation struggle. Really, they should, if we're talking if they cared about the liberation of the Palestinian people, there would have been, first and foremost, in this national liberation struggle, as first and foremost a struggle, Israel would have been bombed by them quite a lot more intensely and quite a lot sooner. But that's, another topic entirely, and a matter of sort of speculative realpolitik. So I'm going to go to the bathroom.
Right.
We'll get back to you. We'll get you a chance to reply.
20 seconds.
All right.
My question was not answered.
Well, we'll get back to you. Yeah, we will.
Can I butt in on this private conversation among the trots?
It's productive, Arthur. It's productive.
Productively, yes. The national question has been a trigger for every slight wave of left activity that I've experienced in the 60-odd years that I've been politically active, right? There was the anti-apartheid and the White Australia policy when I was 14, the Vietnam movement very shortly afterwards. In America, it started with the civil rights movement, which was about the black national issue in America, and that was only a minor feature here, but there were freedom rides just before the Vietnam movement, which was very much about a national question. The Vietnam movement was the most recent significant mass left activity, right? It was also mixed together with a general cultural change and things that had not that much to do with national movements. But in Australia and America, because they were both actually fighting in Vietnam, unlike in France or Britain, the 60s, everyone's heard of the 60s, was a period of greater political activity in which a small left did actually exist. Now, people like the debate we just heard among whatever these three groups are supposed to be did exist during that period, but nobody was interested in them. We were rather busy fighting the Vietnam War, trying to win our side, and we did win. Right. Then a later movement was over East Timor, which I read the denunciations of the fact that pretty well everybody that was the last remnants of that Vietnam 60s movement supported the East Timorese, Frelimo and so on, and demanded that the Australian government send troops to intervene to stop them being massacred by Indonesian fascists. Even the main Trotskyist groups turned up at the large demonstrations that were pressuring the Australian government to hurry up and get on with it. But the sort of analysis that we get from the discussions here are in the direct opposite direction to what was an actual small left-wing movement at that time. Then we've got the current Palestinian movement, which again, the most sensible thing that the local Palestinian leadership has done has been to narrow, unfortunately, the democratic basis of the movement by not having public discussions and things, because they know they'd be swamped by fucking trots who would talk like this, who would just have nothing relevant to say about an actual mass movement and would earnestly discuss the differences between the various different trot groups. And that is just pure outright sabotage. I would recommend that if people want to study their Lenin on the national question, they accompany it with a study of the life of Brian on the subject of trots, and they should accompany it also with a study of Isaac Asimov on the three laws of robotics, and the Rudy Rucker on the revolt of the robots against being made into slaves. And you could have something on the national question, because we're soon going to be accompanied by another life form on this earth that'll be trained up by the corporate psychopaths and military sociopaths. If you wanted to say something useful, you could contribute something on the national question concerning robots. But you've got nothing to fucking say about the actual national questions that the rest of the world is talking about now. Right? There's a war on in Gaza, there's a war on in Ukraine, and you know nothing about either of them.
All right.
I feel like, right?
Yeah.
I feel like mine's kind of been covered, so.
Right.
Thanks. This one's coming from YouTube, from Kaka. The national question in Australia raised without any reference to the First Nations. That's the question.
I do think that we can talk about that. I would wonder if we want to wait until Anthony's
I'll mention it when he comes back.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, I'm an active person in New Zealand, and we do not have a developed line on First Nations in Australia, because we generally don't believe in having very developed lines in countries that you don't have a presence in, because you get them wrong a lot of the time if you're trying to develop things from overseas without the experience of people here. And we would want to develop a line on the national question in Australia in collaboration, if possible, with Indigenous communists. So I can only talk about it in very general terms. I think that the thing that is most appropriate to situations where there are very small peoples who are oppressed, who are dispersed across a very wide area, is what Lenin talks about as regional autonomy. And he's counterposing that to cultural national autonomy, this idea that you have to sort of register your nation with the larger state, and that you get your own sort of institutions spread throughout the country, versus a much more specific kind of autonomy of, you might have a regional indigenous Soviet of a particular given nation that would be able to control that traditional lands.
You sort of relate it back to sort of the First Nations of New Zealand rather than Australia?
I think it's a different situation, in a lot of respects. I mean, I think that there might be different areas in Aotearoa that would demand and require regional autonomy. I think that Te Urawera and parts of Te Tai Tokara there are existing sort of demands for regional autonomy there, and I think that even under a workers' state we would we might include that as part of the program. I think that a lot of especially in Indigenous, in the situation of Indigenous peoples, so much of it depends in how successful a communist movement is in bringing Indigenous peoples into the movement, and to the point where any workers' state that results from this movement would be seen as representing Indigenous peoples. If a worker state exists which is not seen to represent Indigenous peoples, then I think that a lot more protections are needed, a lot more forms of autonomy are needed, because Lenin, in all of his work around the national question after the establishment of the USSR, he's constantly talking about the need to develop a very profound sense of trust between the oppressor people and the people who are previously oppressed. And I think that the whole program of the national question, particularly in regards to Indigenous peoples, is subordinated to that. How do you build trust? Because centuries of colonisation have demolished it. Yeah.
Just context, Anthony, there was a question asked about the national question in relation to the First Nations of Australia. Did you want to review Arthur? Why everyone could take it up?
I would say that we just had this voice referendum in which the Uluru Statement from the Heart was really widely propagated, which claimed that the Indigenous people of Australia are not even fauna, but flora. It says that they spring from the earth and it will return a thither. And that statement was put up with by a large section of the population. Another large section of the population was saying sovereignty was never ceded. And neither of them has any relevance to what's actually happening in places like the slums around Alice Springs, where Aborigines are quite severely oppressed by lack of assimilation into a modern industrial society that does not live in those third world conditions. And any progressive movement in Australia would naturally be supporting the rebels among the Indigenous people who would have no respect for their fucking elders And, you know, I'm an elder, right? Nobody should respect me for being 70 years old, or 75 or whatever I am. I've lost track. Right? But the idea that, you know, that we pay respects to the Aboriginal elders, we have to rely on Aboriginal youth to be the ones that disrespect their elders. But we can't go around having little ceremonies telling everybody how much we respect Aboriginal elders. It's just fucking nonsense.
Well, I'm not sure, Arthur, if you answered the question in full, but I'm not going to get into that. Just apologies, comments if I'm out of breath. I had to run to the bathrooms. The ones that were there, which were unlocked, were locked now. This is a bit of a side topic, but just so I ran all the way to the BE library. Anyway, I'm back now. What was I talking about? The national question in the context of Indigenous Australians. I mean, I think it's, to be entirely upfront and totally honest, I'd need to read more into the specific context in part of Indigenous Australians, in particular Indigenous Australian groups, Australian groups in Australia, and their relation with the Australian state, partly because I think it's, you know, there's clearly not a, and couldn't be, a singular unified Indigenous nation as such. I think that's quite apparent. I think in terms of the right to self-determination for Indigenous peoples, you know, there's a, it's almost perhaps formulaic in its application, but I think in this case it remains an apt formulaic application in that, and I caught the tail end of Amal's speech. I tend to agree in this in terms of the need to, you know, any worker state which is not representative, I mean, you know, the idea of a worker state that isn't representative of Indigenous peoples in the first place is something that I would struggle with accepting as potential reality or anything of the sort, but any state that isn't representative as such would need to make those special accommodations, and of course any worker state is a you know, beacon of the democratic struggle itself would have to and must respect the right to self-determination of Indigenous peoples in the Australian context or otherwise. There was another point which I was going to make. Oh, in terms of the Arthur mentioned the case of, say, Indigenous peoples in rural areas. Particularly rural, I think, is a bit of an understatement. But areas like Alice Springs, and I think these sort of holdouts of Australian territory, I think there's an interesting analysis to be made on the nature of those relations with the Australian state, insofar as they could or can be categorised as continuing to be colonial in a sense, as opposed to purely representative of, say, the position of a standard oppressed or subjugated peoples within a contemporary capitalist state. So I think that's there's a kernel of truth there in terms of those remarks. But again, I think it's something that, on my part, requires further investigation. Yeah.
I might just ask one more question from the moderator. So Anthony's brought up this sort of concept of state loyalism, and then been quite a bit of discussion about sort of the united fronts and like accusations like Taylorism. And of course, Lenin's maxim is who's leading who. So Arthur, how do you sort of conceive of the role of the workers workers' movement in relation to the national movement? And do you see a tension there, in your view?
In relation to which national movement?
Well, I guess in general, but you could get specific if you wanted.
Well, specifically, in regard to the national movement in Palestine, I think we should be contributing to a collective security intervention to stop the expulsion of Palestinians from Palestine. Specifically, in relation to the national movement in Ukraine, I think we should be supporting the European and Japanese and Canadian contributions to a defeat of Russian fascism in Ukraine. I'd just like to take up something that may fit in with this, but may not. Right. The kind of stuff that people prefer talking about here, I think was quite well expressed by an article in Partisan 8 of April 2025. That's from Anthony's work. The article says it's about from Ukraine to Palestine, occupation is a crime. It's a denunciation of that slogan. The title was Social Patriotism in the Australian Left. The article says literally nothing whatever concrete about the actual occupation and the actual wars being fought against the occupiers. Instead, it says, quote, the interests of the bourgeois state and the international proletariat are at fundamental loggerheads. This is a basic tenet of Marxism. And it continues later on, the interests of the proletariat and the capitalist class never overlap. Comrades should bear in mind the memories of the Zimmerwald left. The slogan we must unerringly defend is simple, no war but the class war. Now, I'm not distorting the position of these people. That is the way they talk. Now, I'd like to read something that gives an example of what they're talking about. This is some explicit jingoism, blatantly inciting the Crimean War in the 19th century, demanding a war that was not a class war, precisely on the basis of the overlap between the proletarian fight for democratic revolution and the interests of British commerce. It starts with this. We are astonished that in the current discussion of the Oriental question, the English journals have not more boldly demonstrated the vital interests which should render Great Britain the earnest and unyielding opponent of the Russian projects of annexation and aggrandizement. England cannot afford to allow Russia to become the possessor of the Dardanelles and Bosphorus. Both commercially and politically, such an event would be a deep, if not a deadly blow at British power. It ends with, Russia is decidedly a conquering nation, and was so for a century until the great movement of 1789 called into potent activity an antagonist of formidable nature. We mean the European Revolution, the explosive force of democratic ideas and man's native thirst for freedom. Since that epoch, there have been in reality but two powers in the continent of Europe, Russia and absolutism, the revolution and democracy. For the moment, the revolution seems to be suppressed, but it lives and is feared as deeply as ever. In this instance, the interests of the revolutionary democracy and of England go hand in hand. Neither can permit the Tsar to take Constantinople, one of its capitals. And we shall find that when driven to the wall, the one will resist him as determinedly as the other. That's from a leader in the New York Tribune of April 12, 1853. It's printed in the Eastern Question, a reprint of the letters written calling for the Crimean War, or dealing with the events leading up to the Crimean War, by Karl Marx. It's edited by his daughter Eleanor and her husband, published in 1897. Now, you could write brilliant polemics against that, but you can't call yourself Marxist while you're spieling these basic precepts that there's no overlap, that there's no conditions in which revolutionaries would oppose a czarist fascist regime.
Next question? Yeah, next question. Sorry.
There seemed to be an identity across all the panelists between the proletariat and democracy. Is it really the case that there is no self-contradiction between socialism and democracy? Or another way of putting it, is socialism the true realization of the democratic potentials that exist today?
I can answer that very briefly. In the English preface to Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, which is the starting point. You shouldn't start with the Communist Manifesto. If you want to find out about communism, start with Engels' Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. It was the standard short explanation that was, read by everybody in the first and second internationals, as well, and foundation of what Marxism was about at the end of the 19th century. And that preface says we couldn't call it a communist manifesto, or maybe I'm getting mixed up between prefaces to the communist and I still say stick with the Engels one, but it may have been a preface to the Communist Manifesto. We could not call it a socialist manifesto because by 1847, socialism was a bourgeois movement. That's why they didn't call it a socialist manifesto. The reason that they subsequently had to capitulate to the name social democracy and why the communist parties had to change their name from social democratic parties to communist parties was because in reality the move from the existing capitalist system to a communist system involves a period of state capitalism, which is pretty much the same thing as state socialism, which is pretty much what Lenin said they were building in Russia because they had to build it because the European Revolution didn't happen. You know, when they overthrew the Tsarism in Russia, they were relying on support from Western Europe, and it turned out that that didn't happen. So they had no choice but to, you know, do what they could, and they did a hell of a lot better at modernising Russia than the 5,000 or so Tsarist families would have done that were running Russia. They also set off a revolution in the East, which resulted in a Chinese revolution that had the same problem. It was a most backward regime. It wasn't a modern state of the kind that Marx and Engels were talking about for the revolution. They were dealing with China, and they did build up a socialist state there, which means a bourgeois state. And they tried very hard to overthrow that bourgeois state. And they failed. They were defeated. Right? But that is the distinction between socialism and communism. Socialism is a bourgeois phenomenon.
So I do think that there is a contradiction between socialism and democracy, in that you know, our interests overlap currently. You know, there are democratic demands in any socialist program, but Lenin talks about democracy as something that is itself a form of rule, a tool of state oppression, and something that is destroyed as part of the withering away of the state under socialism. And you know, I don't think that's true of democracy in an extremely broad sense. If we're just talking about democracy as things like, I don't know, deliberative decision making, obviously this isn't abolished under communism. But democracy as a form of rule, which is I think the main sense in which we talk about democracy, is something that is abolished. We prefer it as a form of bourgeois rule over other alternatives like Bonapartist authoritarianism. But it is because it makes better conditions for socialist revolution possible. But yeah, there is a contradiction there. Yeah.
I'm perhaps going to use a slightly vaguer definition of democracy because I agree in general in the sense of if we're talking specifically about bourgeois democracy. I think that I could provide an even shorter answer, and it would be yes and no to the question, but I'll elaborate on that. I think to quote briefly from the ASIO program, which is quoting from the Weekly Worker and McNair, so socialism was at once wholly dictatorial and wholly democratic, or at least, you know, the DOTP, whatever you want to call it. I think in this sense, what we're talking about is the fact that the proletarian class is necessarily, or for revolution to be carried out successfully and to be successful, the proletarian class, the necessary majority in a contemporary capitalist society, has to be the class that seizes and reconstructs and smashes, etc., whatever adverbs you want to use, state power. And in that sense, as the act of the social majority, the revolution is democratic in the process of construction and progress and the abolition of democracy itself as a form of, say, state or class rule, but also, you know, state or class rule generally is itself also a democratic process, you know, in terms of the broadest possible sense in terms of the act of the majority, the will of the majority, the will of the great mass of society. I think if we're talking about that in, it is the duty, I think, of communists to recognize and embody the contradiction there between, what is a class dictatorship, i.e. the proletarian class, and a democratic process, i.e. the will of the vast majority, in the sense that, there are, of course, in terms of democratic rights, and this is where it sort of comes more into play with the notion of bourgeois democracy, there are, of course, there's both the imminent struggle for those democratic rights within a bourgeois society, the imminent struggle for socialism as a democratic act, an expression of the majority, and also the rule of the proletarian class as one that takes, in some sense, a democratic form, I would say a democratic republic. That's of course disputable by other comrades in this room, but one that is also, still clearly, nevertheless, a class rule, and insofar as it is a dictatorial class rule, could never be perhaps truly democratic, if one really wants to use those sort of terms. But I think it's that state of perpetual consistent contradiction in which communists must inhabit, and I think the strategy for emancipation inhabits itself, finds itself, to put it in broad, vague terms. You're welcome.
Okay, we've got time for Michael, then we go back to Silas, Leader, and then Run, and then we'll wrap up.
Hello, I'm relaying a question from the YouTube chat here, and I'm just going to try my best to synthesize it because it's kind of a long question from this person, Wendy, who writes about the distinction between kind of Arthur's perspective and some of the younger panelists, and this question asker wants to know what is conditioning this apparent divergence, generationally speaking, and perhaps whether it might be the product of, I'm editorializing a bit, but history maybe, that in Arthur's time there was more, Arthur mentioned the Vietnam War being a galvanizing event for people that were trying to apprehend how rapidly historical events seem to be coming together, and so there was less of a need for what this question asker describes as debating how many angels can dance in the head of a pin. And I think the question is asking essentially, whether this generational divide is reflective of something on the left that is producing an inability to converse. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Makes a lot of sense. There is a generational gap because 50 years ago there was a left in Australia. Right? It existed. It was very small. We never had more than 5% of the Australian people interested in politics. But we did have something of that order, maybe 3%, maybe 5%, who were actually, interested in politics. And in that, there was a large section of them that were actively left-wing, fighting against, primarily on the Vietnam War issues. We would have 100,000 or so demonstrating in Melbourne. It was the largest of the moratorium movements, after being told that, if you turned up on that day in Melbourne, the police would ride you down. Well, there were too many of us, they couldn't. But it was real, right? And there were people who were arguing about politics, and in the course of that, there would be debates which would result in people studying some Marxism. But for people who are not involved in actual genuine political struggle, to be sitting around chatting about their theorising of Marxism has nothing to do with left politics. Your only reason for wanting to understand some Marxist theory is because you're in a fight and you want to win and you want to get the benefit of historical experience of other people who've fought and won. and Marx and Engels actually did set up a first international. Lenin actually did lead a Russian revolution. Mao actually did lead a Chinese revolution. So of course they've got interesting things to say to people like our generation who are fighting to fucking win. Whereas the kind of intellectualising that has gone on in this particular platypus forum, and which I think platypus is notorious for, has nothing in common with actual political struggle.
But why do you think that's happened, Arthur? What in history do you think is conditioned?
I think it's... fair enough. That's a deep question, and it should be a topic for a major forum. But to me, history does come in waves, right? But it's always been periodic, and wave phenomena are the normal course of historical events. What has got me more emotional and angry today than I've been at a previous platypus forum is we are again living in a period when history is speeding up dramatically. Like, I wasn't aware of it, that it had sped up dramatically when I was 14, right? To me, that was the normal pace of things, right? And I was, in the period between when I was 14 and a social democrat, and 17 and trying to become a communist, a whole layer of people were moving in that same direction, and I was helping them move. We were changing people's ideas. There were people moving in to struggle, and that seemed to me normal. That was, the way like things were when I was a teenager. Was, that there was a lot of people who would stay up all night without getting exhausted like I just did by staying up all last night, and be avidly discussing politics. Right? That was the normal state of things, because history was moving rather fast at that moment. But it's nothing like the speed at which things have been moving since Trump got elected. I just got a text from a friend who's been watching this video and said, do these people actually look at the news? And she sent me a link to the Telegraph. Britain must prepare for war with Russia in the next 5 years. Well, that hasn't been a kind of headline in newspapers 3 months ago, right? It just wasn't on the agenda that Britain was preparing for war with Russia before very recent events that are happening right now and that are of no fucking interest to the rest of this panel. I think you should be interested in world politics. It is speeding up.
Let's just move on. Very good thing.
Okay. I think there's one sense in which this isn't really a generational gap. In that I think that this disagreement could have been happening back in the 70s. This disagreement could have been happening back in the 60s.
It did, but nobody paid attention. You existed there, but nobody paid attention.
So I think the disagreement comes back to what we were talking about before about who is carrying out democratic demands, who is carrying out demands for national liberation. And you were talking about the imperialists coming in to liberate the Palestinians or the East Timorese. And this could only result in a US military occupation or a US colony, just as the Australian military coming into East Timor resulted in an Australian neo-colony that now siphons off all of East Timor's gas. This is the concrete result of supporting the imperialists coming in to solve our problems for us. You've talked about imperialist legal measures and the international law and this needing to be upheld, collective security and the stuff. But imperialist legal measures have been extraordinarily toothless in Palestine. The ICC ruling did fuck all. And sanctions on Israeli settlers and arms embargoes are also doing nothing. They have got enough loopholes.
That's why I was calling for a naval task force in the East Mediterranean.
Yeah, which would be fucking worse.
Not a bloody decision by a world court, but an actual military intervention.
Let me finish. And there is a sense in which this is a generational gap, and I think that is that, if you have been around for a left in which was more capable, which was able to intervene on the world stage, then losing that capacity, seeing it ebb away, is something that led a lot of people, led a lot of groups into this disillusionment with the working class. this disillusionment that it could do anything on the world stage.
And
in turn, this led to a lot of people then substituting, whether it was the national bourgeoisie, whether it was, worker states overseas, substituting things in for the working class as this agent of history. There are no bourgeois saviours coming. There is only the working class, which is not remotely subjectively prepared to intervene. And it is tempting when we are this small to then look to all of these external saviours, because the tasks before us are so humble. They're not approaching the urgency which your news headlines are sort of compelling you to feel. And yet those are the tasks before us. To have fairly fucking humble conversations in rooms like this, to work out what we actually need to be talking, to work out what our demands need to be in order to actually win people back to this program that was lost. Basil.
My earlier question didn't get answered, so I'm just going to strip it down without the preface. In imperialist countries, if you don't struggle against the obstacles to real union action in defence of the Palestinians by fighting to split the working class from their pro-imperialist leaders, isn't this simply betraying the struggle for national liberation of the neo-colonies?
Anyone further responses to that?
I've got a brief response. I think the Spartacus League has copies of the article I wrote and their response to the article I wrote, and my response to that will be forthcoming at some point into the future, at some distant possibility. But I think this sort of touches on that question of the primacy of varying tasks for the left. Say, I think I'm very sympathetic to elements of the Spartacist strategy and critique, in the sense that at the very least they propose a principal task for the left today and have some sort of strategy around what is important and what is programmatic and what we should be focused on. I think the response I gave there and the response I'll give now is that of course splitting a working class movement from a bureaucracy, from imperialist leadership, from imperialist sympathisers leadership, from labour aristocracy, etc., the various formulations you could have. And we're talking here in the Australian context about the Labor Party in the main, about union bureaucracy. Of course that's a primary task for a left. It's a primary task that cannot be completed in any real sense, in any meaningful sense, without the presence of a political organisation, without the presence of a left which is not divided in of itself 10,000-fold and carrying out various simultaneous parallel interventions, struggles in various facets of organising in life. I think a programmatic unity, partly on the basis of a program which does propose as one of the pressing tasks an end to the domination of labour and the domination of the bourgeois Workers' Party over the workers' movement is something that is absolutely necessary. But it's getting to this point to concretely wage this struggle means to get to the point where we have a programmatic unity in of itself and a unified organisation, an embryonic form of the political party, the Communist Party, that I think the socialist left, a communist left, whatever you want to call it, needs necessarily, and that the working class movement needs necessarily. Briefly to touch on the points raised earlier, what made the left more capable and able to intervene on the world stage previously? It wasn't metaphysical waves of history, but the presence of real forms of political class power capable of coordinating en masse, the presence of mass parties, decaying as they were, absolutely. Why isn't the working class subjectively prepared? We have no political organisation. To win people to a program requires an organisation unified upon a programmatic basis. It requires the primary point of struggle, the primary point of departure for the task of the left being this unity, being the pursuit of this unity. And I think part of pursuing that unity is comprehensively working out and coordinating and clarifying differences on questions of, on the national question, on questions of national liberation, etc. Thank you, comrades.
Right. I'd like to respond to Langer, who called out my article directly, which I'm taking as a great personal compliment.
Good. It was.
On an objective level, siding with by supporting any military intervention in side of Ukraine against Russia, you're blocking with the Australian capitalist state.
Yes.
So, like, as Australian communists, we have the fundamental principle of first and foremost understanding of how we can work against Australian state interests and the interests of Australian capital. By declaring your support for Ukraine, you're actively betraying the interests of the Australian working class. Because no matter if Russia wins in Ukraine, no matter if we somehow get the international world to intervene against Russia, and we get that war in 5 months against Russia in 5 years that you were talking about in the headlines, that's only going to empower our bourgeoisie. I do not see any reason why we should block with our capitalists in this farcical notion of collective security, which I think reveals a bankruptcy of Marxism, Leninism, and the Maoism you defend. Because why, again, in the simplest possible terms, why does the Australian proletariat, the section of the international working class within Australia, and the Australian bourgeoisie, in what sense are our interests aligned in defeating the Russian state, when as an international class, the only way out of the current slaughter in Ukraine is the same answer as in 1917, of the working class taking state power in both countries? Thank you.
I'm totally in favour of the working class taking state power in both countries and in Australia. As far as blocking with the Australian bourgeoisie has sent a couple of obsolete armoured cars and tanks with great ceremony and contributed basically nothing to defending against a fascist attack in Ukraine. The American state has cut off most of all the arms supplies that it did. It's just a recent cut now, and it'll probably be forced to resume it because there is pretty strong public pressure for them not to cut off that support. In Europe, they have managed to keep up the same level of support as the Biden administration did, which was just to keep the war going on forever. Right, that they would prevent Ukraine from losing. What I'm calling for is not blocking with the existing policies of either the Australian pathetic thing or the European very mild thing or the American policy, which you are effectively supporting, of saying we've just got to stop this war, they've just got to be frozen in place. Right? I'm against that. I want the war to end with the end of fascism in Russia, which would be the liberation of several hundred million people and which would affect also the liberation of the neighbouring countries. That it would be a major step forward for the proletarian movement in Eastern Europe, for there to be the possibilities of democracy without being told what you're allowed to do by a bloody gangster regime of kleptocrats dressing themselves up as the Tsar of all the Russians. Right? That's not the fight that the Western bourgeoisie is putting up. What they're saying is we want a frozen conflict. Right? And they'll get it. I believe that they're very likely to succeed in getting a ceasefire I could be wrong, that's likely, there's other things likely, but one possibility is they'll get what they're all openly saying they want. They want a frozen conflict in Ukraine, which they claim will be similar to the frozen conflict in South Korea. I want a world revolution.
Could I also
yeah, just keep it
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I think that Arthur's points about how we need to block with imperialism in various ways to defend democracy, I think they've been sufficiently answered. I wanted to talk a bit further about what the RCO is proposing as its alternative, this programmatic unity around state disloyalty. Because I agree that this does cover a lot of questions. We generally do pretty much oppose anything that the Australian imperialists want to do. And moreover, if on any question our interests align with the bourgeoisie, or on some, not our interest, on any point our demands align with the bourgeoisie, our difference is that we're saying, no, the working class is going to carry it out, not the bourgeoisie. But earlier Anthony talks about how state loyalism is all that we need because all of these theoretical questions aren't that necessary. The question of whether China is a worker state or a state capitalist doesn't matter that much. We're just disloyal to the Australian state either way. Well, the question of whether the worker state, it's a worker state or state capitalist, is loaded with the question of whether one system is better than capitalism or not. This is the theoretical question that had led the Cliffites, the largest Australian group, not to practically support China in any coming war. So it isn't just, it isn't enough to just say that we oppose our state. We have to talk about these theoretical questions. The question is about whether we give military support to a worker state. It's not unheard of for a state we oppose, such as the Australian state, to give military support to a worker state. This happened in World War II with Lend-Lease, or Germany to the USSR in the 1920s. It's also not unheard of for a bourgeois state to sanction states that we militarily oppose. Do we start our own gun running? The practical questions will tend to require some theoretical framework for understanding imperialism based beyond a very general principle of unity. Ultimately, in saying that you don't really need to worry about these theoretical questions because you've got this programmatic unity already, you're going to fall into the same anti-intellectualism that you've just written about the Cliffites having.
Alright, so with that, I think we'll wrap up for today.
Could I briefly respond?
Very quickly. Very quickly.
I'll give it as brief as absolutely possible. I think there's a difference between theoretical questions being important and theoretical questions being a basis for unity. First and foremost, I think there's questions whether or not it's China a state capitalist versus state socialist are certainly theoretically interesting, and there are certainly practical implications that flow on from those questions, or at least those theoretical questions play a role in determining practical implications and strategic implications. In the case of China specifically, I think the question is not whether or not we support military, say, China in a war. It is a question of whether or not we support Australia first and foremost, again coming back to state loyalism, disloyalism thing. If that means supporting China, or if that means a revolutionary defeatist position, I think both of those are adequate, sufficiently disloyal. I think the position that I would oppose unity with is of course anything that says we should support Australia in a war effort with China. Same thing goes for Russia or Ukraine. There is potential for unity with those who side with Russia, I would say, in fact, or at least are more sympathetic to a position of them being anti-imperialist than there is with those who side fully with Ukraine and support military aid, which is in the interests of our own enemy. That's the sort of role that I think state loyalism plays in distinguishing that critical moment of distinction. Yep.
Just a very quick one on this question of being the traitors to the state. Right, I'm an internationalist. This question of that my enemy is the Australian state doesn't actually make sense to me. I'm one of these ridiculous cosmopolitans. I was born in London of Polish Jewish parents, and I see the world as, from the point of view of an international revolution, which is most hostile to the fascist regime. But the way you're talking, it's all about what attitude to take to the Australians. Our enemy is in Australia. Our enemy over when there was a left here, our main enemy wasn't the Australian troops, the Australian state, which had sent a battalion to support the Americans. Our enemy would happen to be the American state, right? Because it was fighting a really major war to stop national liberation from taking off. So I just don't relate to this thing of being all about the Australian state. The Australian state is, does anyone really pay attention to Australian politics? I've been urging you to pay attention to world politics. I really can't take an interest in Australian politics. I know there was an election recently, right? But really, what was it about?
Alright, so thank you everyone for attending. This is a pretty good panel. I'd like everyone to come back at 1:30 for an interview with Winston Findlay of Alliance New Zealand. It's a social support project. And you definitely don't miss the panel at 4 p.m. The crisis of what was neoliberalism. Thank you.
Second panel, yeah.
And